Corrupt mayor. Tries to fire a black officer. Then, the governor's arrival changes everything. Mayor Richard Calloway smirked as he slid a thick envelope across his desk. "You're finished, Officer Davis." Across from him, Officer James Davis sat motionless, his jaw clenched. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, a symbol of everything he had worked for. But now, it was being stripped away. Calloway leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "You think you can challenge me? This is my city, and in my city, officers who don't know their place don't get to wear the badge." Davis knew the truth. This wasn't about performance. This was punishment. Punishment for refusing to cover up the mayor's dirty dealings. "Sign it," Calloway ordered, his grin widening. "Your career is over." Davis's fingers hovered over the pen, but before he could sign, the door swung open. A calm, commanding voice rang out. "Not so fast, Mayor Calloway." The entire room froze, and when they turned to the doorway, Calloway's smirk vanished instantly, because standing there, flanked by security and legal advisors, was Governor Elaine Carter. And she wasn't here for small talk. The air inside City Hall's grand office was tense. The large oak desk, the leather chairs, the expensive whiskey set on the side table, everything screamed power. And Mayor Richard Calloway loved power. He had built his reputation as a ruthless politician, wealthy, well-connected, and completely corrupt. To him, loyalty was bought, and anyone who opposed him was disposable. And right now, Officer James Davis was his next target. Davis sat across from the mayor, his broad shoulders squared, his dark brown eyes steady. He had been a police officer for over a decade, serving his community with honor. He wasn't just respected, he was loved. And that made him a threat to Calloway, because Davis had done something no other officer dared to do. He had refused to stay silent. Weeks ago, Davis had uncovered evidence of the mayor's illegal dealings, bribes, misuse of public funds, and corruption running deep into the city's leadership. And instead of covering it up, he reported it. The mayor had tried to intimidate him, bribe him, even threaten his family. But Davis never backed down. So now, Calloway was using his last weapon, termination. The police chief, a man too afraid to challenge the mayor, sat silently in the corner, watching. A few other officers stood nearby. Some looked away, while others wore expressions of guilt. They knew this was wrong. But no one spoke up. Because everyone feared the mayor, everyone, except Davis. The mayor leaned forward, his grin widening. "This city belongs to me, Davis. I decide who stays and who goes." He tapped the termination letter on the desk. "And after today, you're gone." Davis's jaw tightened. He wasn't a fool. He knew what this was. He knew the system was stacked against him. But before he could respond, the doors burst open. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. A voice rang out, clear, powerful, and commanding. "Not so fast, Mayor Calloway." The room fell into stunned silence, because standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the room, was Governor Elaine Carter, and from the way she looked at the mayor, she already knew everything. A heavy silence filled the office as Governor Elaine Carter stepped inside. Her dark, gray suit was crisp, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, taking in every detail, every nervous glance. Behind her stood 2 legal advisors, a state investigator, and 2 security personnel. This wasn't a social visit. This was a reckoning. The officers in the room stiffened. The police chief's fingers twitched nervously. Even Mayor Calloway, the man who had never feared anyone, looked momentarily uneasy. But he recovered quickly. His cocky grin returned as he stood up, adjusting his suit. "Governor Carter," he said smoothly. What an unexpected surprise. The governor didn't smile. Instead, she turned her gaze to Officer James Davis. "Are you okay, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Davis, still seated, nodded firmly. "I'm fine, ma'am." Calloway let out a low chuckle. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "There's no need for all this. We're just handling an internal department issue. Nothing for the state to be concerned about." The governor's eyes hardened. She slowly walked to the desk, her heels clicking against the floor. She picked up the termination papers, and then, in one smooth motion, she tore them in half. Gasps filled the room. The officers stared. The police chief's eyes widened, and for the first time, Calloway's smug grin disappeared. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped. Governor Carter turned to face him fully. "I should be asking you that, Mayor Calloway." She tossed the torn papers aside. "Because as of today, this investigation is no longer just internal." Calloway's face twitched. Davis kept his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew. The mayor was caught. Calloway let out a forced laugh, raising his hands in mock innocence. "Investigation? I'm not sure what you're implying, Governor." The governor's lips curled slightly. She turned to her legal advisors. "Play the recording." One of them stepped forward, placing a small device on the desk. A moment later, a familiar voice filled the room. It was Calloway's voice. "I don't care what it takes. Davis needs to be out. I run this city, and no one, especially some loudmouthed officer, gets to make me look weak." A cold chill swept through the room. The mayor's face went pale. The officers exchanged stunned glances. Davis stayed quiet, waiting. The police chief, who had been silent the entire time, now looked sick. Because this was evidence, undeniable, unforgivable, unstoppable. The governor leaned in. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Care to explain, Mayor?" Calloway's lips parted, but nothing came out. Because for the first time in his life, he had no way out. The room felt like a pressure cooker. The officers stood frozen, eyes darting between Governor Carter and Mayor Calloway. The damning recording still echoed in their ears. "I don't care what it takes. Davis needs to be out. I run this city, and no one, especially some loudmouthed officer, gets to make me look weak." Calloway's face had drained of color. His once smug grin was gone. His hands tightened into fists, but he was trapped. Governor Carter folded her arms, watching him carefully. "Go ahead, Mayor," she said coolly. "Explain yourself." For the first time in his life, Calloway was at a loss for words. But his arrogance, it wasn't gone yet. He let out a forced laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "You think some edited recording is enough to challenge my authority?" The governor's legal advisor stepped forward. "It's not just one recording, Mr. Mayor." He pulled out a folder and laid it on the desk. Calloway's eyes flicked to it, and his stomach twisted. The legal advisor opened the folder. Inside were documents, bank statements, signed approvals, all tied to illegal activity. The governor picked up a paper. "Bribes, fraud, misuse of city funds, all under your administration." Calloway's hands began to shake. Governor Carter's eyes darkened. "And let's not forget the reports of intimidation against city employees, including members of the police force." She turned to Officer Davis. "Does this sound familiar?" Davis nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." For the first time, the police chief cleared his throat. His voice was uneasy. "Governor Carter, She raised a hand, silencing him. "You had a choice to speak up before. You didn't. So now, I'm not asking you." The chief went pale. Calloway's anger boiled over. He slammed his hands on the desk. "You have no right to interfere in my city." The governor raised an eyebrow. Actually, I do. Because as of now, she slid a document toward him. Calloway hesitated. Then, slowly, his eyes widened in horror. An official state order, signed by the governor. Effective immediately, Mayor Richard Calloway was under investigation. The office erupted into whispers. The officers shifted uncomfortably, looking at one another. The police chief rubbed his forehead, visibly shaken. And Calloway? For the first time in his career, he was powerless. His breathing grew heavy. "You can't do this to me." The governor's security stepped forward. "Actually, sir, we can." One of them held out handcuffs. A cold sweat broke over Calloway's forehead. His eyes darted toward his police chief, his staff, anyone who might help him. But no one did, because they knew his reign was over. And then, the worst moment of all. One of the officers pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, we have an official state order. We need to detain Mayor Richard Calloway for questioning." The words rang out like a death sentence. Calloway staggered back, shaking his head. "Wait! No, I can fix this!" he shouted. But no one was listening, because for the first time, he was nothing. Officer Davis, who had sat silently the entire time, finally stood up. He stepped forward, his expression calm but firm, and then he did what Calloway never expected. He looked him in the eye and said nothing, because Calloway wasn't worth his words. And that was the final blow. As Calloway was escorted out of his own office in handcuffs, the room remained silent. And in that moment, Davis knew justice had finally come, and it had never looked better. The hallways of City Hall buzzed as officers escorted Mayor Calloway out in handcuffs. People whispered, pointed, shook their heads in disbelief. The once untouchable mayor was now just another corrupt politician falling from grace. And yet, despite the humiliation, Calloway still clung to denial. "This is a mistake," he barked, struggling against the officers. "I built this city. You all work for me." But no one responded. No one cared, because now he was powerless. As he was dragged through the lobby, his former allies, city officials, and staff members turned away. The same people who had once feared him, obeyed him, even admired him, now refused to meet his eyes. His power had disappeared the moment the truth was exposed. And the truth had been waiting for him all along. Back inside the mayor's office, Governor Carter remained. She turned to Officer Davis, who stood silently by the desk. He had watched Calloway's downfall unfold without a single word. Now she stepped forward. "You didn't just stand up to him, Officer Davis," she said, studying him. "You played a role in bringing him down, didn't you?" Davis finally met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." The officers stiffened. Even the police chief looked shocked. The governor raised an eyebrow. "Tell me." Davis exhaled, and for the first time he revealed the truth. Weeks ago, Davis had known Calloway would come after him. The mayor was too powerful, too corrupt. He wouldn't let a single officer challenge him. So Davis made a choice. Instead of waiting to be silenced, he started gathering evidence. He met with state investigators, leaked documents, and reported everything. And then he did something even riskier. He allowed himself to become the bait. He knew Calloway would try to fire him. He knew the mayor would push until Davis was out of the way. And when that moment came, Governor Carter and her team were ready. The officers stared at Davis. Even the police chief, who had once been too afraid to act, looked at him with newfound respect. Davis had been one step ahead the entire time. He hadn't just stood his ground. He had helped take down a corrupt leader. And now, because of his courage, the city had a chance to rebuild. The governor nodded slowly. You didn't just save your job, Officer Davis. You saved this department. For the first time that night, Davis allowed himself a small smile. Justice had won, and for the first time in a long time, the city was free. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, every major news outlet had one headline: Mayor Richard Callaway arrested, corruption exposed. The city was in shock. The man who had ruled with fear and intimidation was now being paraded in front of cameras as a criminal. And, standing at the center of it all, Officer James Davis. At the precinct, things were different now. The fear that had once controlled the officers, gone. The silence that had allowed corruption to thrive, broken. For the first time in years, they felt free. The officers who had once been too afraid to speak out now walked with their heads high. And as Davis entered the department, they stood, a room full of uniformed officers, standing in respect. The police chief, who had once looked away in fear, stepped forward. "Davis," he said, clearing his throat, "I was wrong. I should have stood with you from the beginning." Davis met his gaze, then gave a small nod. "What matters is what we do now." The chief held out his hand. Davis shook it. And with that, the department finally turned a new page. Later that afternoon, Governor Carter stood before the press. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for a statement. She took a deep breath, then spoke. Corruption can only survive in silence. But one officer refused to stay silent. One officer put his job, his safety, and his future on the line for the truth. She turned slightly, gesturing toward Officer Davis, who stood beside her. Today, Officer Davis is not just a member of the police force. He is a symbol of integrity, a symbol of justice, a reminder that one voice, no matter how outnumbered, can change everything. The room erupted into applause. But Davis, he wasn't in this for praise or recognition. He was in this because it was the right thing to do. As the city moved forward, Richard Callaway sat alone in a holding cell. The man who had once controlled an entire city now had nothing, no power, no allies, no way out. And as he stared at the cold metal bars, he finally understood. Karma had done its work, and there was no undoing it. That evening, Davis walked out of the precinct, the cool night air filling his lungs. Sophie, his wife, stood waiting for him, a proud smile on her face. She wrapped her arms around him. "It's over." Davis exhaled. "Yeah, it is." She pulled back, studying his face. "Do you regret it?" Davis shook his head. "Not for a second. Because at the end of the day, doing the right thing was never a mistake. And now he had proof. The city was free. Corrupt mayor tries to fire a black officer. Then the governor's arrival changes everything. Richard Callaway thought he was untouchable. He used his power to silence, intimidate, and destroy anyone who stood against him. But in the end, he was the one destroyed. Because Officer James Davis refused to stay silent. He chose justice over fear, truth over corruption. And because of that, the city was free. Callaway lost everything. And Davis? He gained something far greater: respect, honor, and the knowledge that doing the right thing is always worth it. So now, let's ask you, what would you have done in Officer Davis's place? Have you ever witnessed injustice? Did you speak up or stay silent? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more powerful, eye-opening stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Thank you for watching. And remember, justice always wins in the end. Until next time.